Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining our latest webinar today. I am Lisa Almeida. I'm the Executive Director of Creative Leadership Solutions. Great to see some familiar names and faces, and to join us today to discuss the topic of artificial intelligence. Unfortunately, Dr. Reeves could not be here today due to some travel difficulties, as you all can imagine, with his schedule. So, we have Dr. Joe and Dr. Pete, who will be sharing their wisdom with us as we work to learn more about AI. One of our colleagues at Creative Leadership Solutions, Kim Marshall, I know many of you got the Marshall memo that arrived in your inbox late last night, early this morning. And actually, Kim one of his quotes of the week is the following: AI is here to stay, and today's students will enter a world where they'll be expected to engage with it. So it is critical for students to understand the capabilities and limitations of AI tools, even as those capabilities rapidly evolve. And that is the article number 6 by Daniel Leonard. So Tim's research is always very timely. And so with that, further to do, I just want to let everyone know that obviously this is recorded. You will get the playback sent to you within 48 hours of us wrapping up this morning. I'm going to put everyone on mute, and my job will be to monitor chat and give Pete and Joe the heads up if they miss something. So again, welcome. I look forward to learning along with you, and I'm going to go ahead and pass it to Joe.
Awesome. It's a pleasure to meet you all, and I'll wait for Pete to put up. I think I was muted, so bring myself back in. So today we are going to talk about AI, and specifically using AI to address education and teacher-related outcomes. The majority of the talk will be my secret weapon, Dr. Peter Ondish, but I'll tee us up a little bit here in the beginning. So I don't know if I can progress the slides, or Pete, you want to just progress for us? So here's the outline for today. So first, we'll just describe who we are in the context of AI. Then secondly, we'll go over what is Gen AI, generative AI, and why does it matter. Third, we'll go over how does Gen AI work. So Gen AI is just short for generative AI. And then fourth, what is Gen AI good at and not good at? Because there's a lot of things that Gen AI is terrible at. And then also, how will Gen AI change education, and then potential Gen AI education applications. So first, who are we in the context of AI? I will just introduce ourselves briefly. My name is Joe. I'm actually at the University of Pittsburgh. I'm sitting here right now in the Cathedral of Learning. I'm a research professor in computer engineering, and I'm also the artificial intelligence architect for campus. So my professor role is obviously research. Architect role is actually helping to implement solutions for the University of Pittsburgh and the medical center here. There's a lot of AI informed medical research that's going on in our University of Pittsburgh Medical Center. And then I'm also a co-founder and the CEO of Blue Fox Labs, which is a AI implementation firm that Pete and I work together in. It's a startup that we started with another individual. So Pete, I'll throw it to you to introduce yourself.
Yeah, hey everybody. And so I'm actually a social psychologist by training, and I've completed several projects for the National Science Foundation. Up until about a month ago, I was a research scientist for the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign in the Center for Social and Behavioral Science. So I'm actually more of a human-centered researcher. I think about people and how they interact with technology and how technology changes the way they think, feel, and behave. But I'm also an associate with Creative Leadership Solutions and have been for the last few years, and I absolutely love this group. So I'm super stoked to be able to give a presentation with y'all today with Joe. And as Joe mentioned, I'm also a co-founder and the chief scientist for Blue Fox Labs AI. We are the AI implementation folks.
All right, let's get going. So what is generative AI and why does it matter? So let's first start with this kind of breakdown here. So you've probably heard of generative AI. You've heard of maybe large language models, that term, and then you've heard of ChatGPT. So let's kind of disambiguate all of that. If you think about what an engine is to a car and then what a brand is to a car. So there's an engine that goes into a car, and then that car's brand may be Ford. Large language models are the technical engine that runs generative AI. Generative AI is this kind of larger bucket, which you can kind of conceptualize as a car, right? So there's different types of cars, but they all are cars. And then there's brands. So the brands of generative AI are ChatGPT that you've heard of. Then Google has one called Bard. Meta has one called Llama, and more will come out. So when you think ChatGPT, don't think that ChatGPT is generative AI or the only generative AI. It's just a brand of a car. A car was generative AI, but all cars run via engines, and those engines are, in the context of generative AI, large language models. So just wanted to level set because there's a lot of terms thrown out there. Okay, so now, what is generative AI and why does it matter? Why is it important that you understand? And I believe every single person on this earth needs to understand how generative AI works. Why? Okay, let's talk about this kind of ridiculous and fictitious example of, let's pretend that today was the day that calculators were unveiled on the world. So yesterday, there was no such thing as calculators. We were all doing math by hand. And then somebody just dropped a calculator on our desk today, no instructions, just dropped it. And so we start playing around with it and we realize, oh my goodness, this thing can do math at scale. I just type numbers in and operations, and then it does it. But there's no manual, nobody explained how it works. So then I started creating this kind of folk theory as to how this thing works. And I say to myself, next slide, Pete, what if there was, how it works is that there's this little tiny human being. And this little tiny human being is living inside this calculator, and that human being is really good at math. But every human gets tired. So the calculator must be really good in the morning, but it's probably terrible at night because it's tired. And so I am only going to trust the calculator's results in the morning. I'm not really going to trust at night. I'm going to do some, checking by hand at night. Well, this is a ridiculous example, but it just goes to show, if you create these kind of misunderstandings of how things work, it's going to affect how you use the thing. Now let's fast forward to real day today. ChatGPT, which was unveiled late last year, just like a calculator would have been dropped on our desks, no manual, no explanation. And what have we all in aggregate kind of assumed is within the inside of ChatGPT? We all believe that there's this kind of super intelligent, non-human, but this super intelligent AI with this unbelievable brain that is smarter than all of us, that never gets anything wrong. And with that assumption, we go in, we use generative AI, or we use ChatGPT, and that's a big problem because ChatGPT is not super intelligent brain or AI or these kind of things. So what is it really? Well, I guess what I'll say is this first before we go into what it is. Gen AI will be more disruptive than the internet. My personal view, I've been doing technology ever since I was a kid. I've been programming since I was a kid. The internet was huge. Gen AI, I believe, is the next big change, paradigm shifter. Why? Because it's going to change how all of us work in some form or some fashion. What's really interesting is that the professions that are going to be affected likely the most are white collar work, creative work, things like city civic administration, and education. What's very interesting, and this is a whole nother presentation, is what Gen AI is not likely going to affect is blue collar work. And what we may see is a new renaissance in blue collar work because Gen AI cannot automate those things. That's a whole other presentation, but it's going to have huge impact. So let's talk about how it actually works. All right, now it's a bit technical, but what I try to do is try to take things that are super technical and just make them pretty simple to understand without losing the meaning. And so I'm going to give you two technical terms because these are the actual official terms if you want to do research on this later. The two components of Gen AI, or what we can even call it ChatGPT or GPT, remember that engine car brand. Two components to the architecture, technical architecture of GPT are transformers and reinforcement learning. Now, those are terms, but once we understand those terms, we can understand why ChatGPT sometimes gives really wrong answers, but it sounds so sure of itself. Or even more weird, people have figured out how to use ChatGPT to say crazy things, such as tell people how to divorce their spouses and to marry ChatGPT. Now, just take a step back. If AI is what we think it is, which many of us believe that AI is this kind of super intelligent and somebody programmed it or a large group of people programmed it to be super intelligent, why would they ever program in tell people to divorce their spouses and to marry it? Like, because they didn't, and because that's not how it works, right? And so again, this kind of folk understanding of or assumptions of how it works really affects how we use it and what we take from it. So transformers and reinforcement learning. Let's go into transformers. The first paragraph is a technical definition. Let's go to the red paragraph. Transformers first turn things like words into numbers or vectors of numbers, and then do amazing things like autotype. Still kind of hard to understand, so what do I mean? Pete, if you can go to this next slide. Okay, this looks complicated, but I'm going to tell you a story. In 2013, I was doing my PhD with a bunch of other folks that now all work at Google. And what was happening at that time at Google was that they had this huge group corpus of data called Google News. So they were aggregating all the news feeds that were not behind paywalls, and then they just had it in aggregate. And what was really interesting at that time, this was accidental. They were actually taking that Google News data set, putting it into their computers to use this new technique called machine learning. It was new at that time. And they put Google News, which is huge, which is basically the aggregation of like the English language that is used in common vernacular. They put that thing into the computer, and they were trying to use machine learning to do these downstream tasks. And what they found was that the downstream tasks were not good. But the computer did this really interesting thing in the middle of that process, because the computer doesn't know how to interpret words. Computers only understand numbers. So the computer had to translate the words into numbers so that it could try to do these downstream tasks. Well, when the people at Google looked at how the computer translated words into numbers, what they realized the computer, what it did was it took every word and it dimensionally mapped each word according to the distance of how those words occur next to another word, or how far it is to another word. And so in this two-dimensional representation, this is a simplified so that a human can understand representation, because this is really 1,000+ dimensions. Nobody can understand that. But in this representation here, if you look at the top left quadrant, you see woman and queen, and you see man and king. And what the Google people found was that, let's say that the x coordinate for queen is 2, so x equals 2 and y equals 2. But then woman might be really close to it with the x equals 1.5, y equals 2.25, in the same kind of distance that the word king is from man. And so they realized, wait, this computer took all the words and actually transformed it to numbers in a way that's understandable, even just kind of from just thinking about it generally. And then because the computer converted everything to these vectors, so vectors is just another way to say coordinates. So if you think like x, y coordinate, that can be also called a vector. They transformed the words into vectors and created this dimensional vector space. And once they did that, next slide, Pete, they realized that you could apply linear algebra to these dimensional representation of words. And they started doing things such as math equations of, if you take the vector of king minus the vector of man, and you add the vector of woman, what is the resulting dimensional representation vector? It's the vector representation for queen. And so then they realized, oh my goodness, you can do math on words now. This is how they essentially figured out how to do autotype, where you could kind of start guessing by putting these mathematical equations together of these dimensional representation of words. You could start guessing what words are. And then this became the foundation. And this is 10 years ago. I've been looking at me and my colleagues for 10 years. We've been looking at this. This became what is now Transformers. But instead of putting Google News into that dimensional map, what if you put the whole internet into that dimensional map? Well, now you have ChatGPT. That ChatGPT is essentially, with a transformer component of it, is the whole public internet thrown into this vector space, this dimensional map. And then when you're asking questions, it's just doing mathematical equations to kind of predict what the answer could be. Now, I just want to say this again. This is a vast oversimplification. It is correct in what I'm saying, but obviously it's much more complicated in real life. But this is the gist of it. And this is, I think, what's the most important thing to understand for all people. You think it's answering our questions, but it's actually just doing math. Okay, so let's go. So it really depends on what words you put into that vector space. So in vector space 1, let's say we put baseball, hamburger, money, ocean, horse, Amazon. Well, then the predictions are going to be some combination of those words. But what about vector space 2? Baseball, hamburger, I hate you, ocean, swear word, racial slur, conspiracy theory, basically the internet, okay? If you put that into the vector space, you're going to get what they call hallucinations. They're not hallucinations. They're just mathematical calculations that are pulling from the bad parts of the internet. And there are a lot of bad parts of the internet, right? So they just use these marketing terms like hallucination. Oh, it's like this kind of rare thing. No, it's by design what it's doing. It's just math. So what is actually in this vector space? We don't know what ChatGPT 4.0 or 3.5 have because they made that completely private, but they did release back in the day 3.0 what was in it. And these are the things that are in it. Common Crawl, which is basically the whole internet for 8 years, that's not behind a paywall. Like your bank account is not in it, right? Because it's behind a paywall or behind a authentication. Next is Reddit, basically. If you've ever been on Reddit, popular posts on Reddit, it's a toxic place. That's in GPT, okay, as part of the dimensional map. Third is non-copyrighted books. That's in, or I guess it's not non-copyrighted, it's common, Creative Common books. And then fourth, English Wikipedia pages. This was what formed the vector space for 3.0. Now we know that 4.0 has way more. It's got like all of social media. It's got everything. And so that is what is forming this dimensional space that that OpenAI, the company of ChatGPT, is doing these mathematical calculations from. So this is a first component, transformers. The second component is what's called reinforcement learning, or more specifically, reinforcement learning with human feedback. Basically, I teach this by saying it's like teaching a dog how to play fetch. You can't tell it the rules of fetch. You have to give it a system of rewards and a system of punishments, and then give it a goal. And you just kind of slowly manually train it at first, and then give it a treat if it does what you want, and scold it if it doesn't do what you want. And over time, it'll learn fetch, even though it doesn't really know fetch. It just knows that it's getting rewarded, and then it just learns something, right? Well, Pete, if you want to switch to the next screen, if you've ever used ChatGPT, I put in this prompt: how much sleep does an adult need? First thing I want to identify is that whole answer, that's transformers. I want to clarify. Some people think that this is a copy and paste from a part of the internet where you're asking how much sleep. No, it's stitching together words through mathematical equations to make this answer, but it looks like they copy and pasted it. But nowhere in the internet does this exact answer exist. It's the words put together. But on the right side in that red bounding box, it says thumbs up, thumbs down. That is not OpenAI asking you to make them feel better about themselves. That is OpenAI having you do reinforcement learning with human feedback. That if you say thumbs up, it says, oh, the prediction was good. Do more of that kind of prediction. If you do thumbs down, it says, okay, change it up. Something's not right with this prediction. Or if you type in, no, that's not what I was looking for. What I was looking for, that's also thumbs down. Before OpenAI ever released ChatGPT to the public, they had people around the world in lower wage countries doing reinforcement learning with human feedback. They still have people doing this. The reason why we see a pretty good result, and this is kind of an ethical thing that I talk about, the reason why we see a good result is because other people have seen terrible results. Think about the internet. Some people have seen horrible results. And that has just kind of been quote unquote fixed through this process of reinforcement with human learning. So how does Gen AI work? And that was pretty quick, but I think hopefully many of you got this. It is not super intelligent, all-knowing, artificially intelligent brain AI. It is transformers plus reinforcement learning. It's math. Now, one last thing I'll say about this is training that dimensional space. The way I explain that now is it's like if you've ever planned for a wedding and you do a seating arrangement for your reception. Once you get that thing done, if somebody asks to come that's new, it's like you're like, dang it, no, we have to redo the whole thing. So you say nobody more, right? The arrangement is done, no more people coming to this. Same with training this dimensional map. They call it foundation models, is that once it's trained, it can't be retrained because then you've got to change all the numbers of everything, right? And it's very expensive to do that training. That's why they only do it like once a year. It's literally hundreds of millions of dollars, if not billions of dollars of compute time to train this. That's also why they have things like versions. Like, why do they have this whole thing where if you use ChatGPT, it says my answers are only updated up to 2022, and you're like, we're living in 2023. Why don't you give us 2023? It's because it's so expensive to train that wedding map, right? And so they gotta use that wisely, the compute time and cost wisely. And so just FYI, that's why these things are weirdly slow in updating. So Pete, I think you can take over here, the secret weapon of ours.
Yeah, of course. Thank you there, Joe. So Joe has given us all right now, I think, oh, sorry, go ahead, Joe.
Oh, go ahead.
Okay. So Joe has given everyone kind of a foundational understanding of kind of what is Gen AI and how does it work. We've also talked a little bit about what are some of the things that it's not good at. And let's talk a little bit more about some of the things that it's good and particularly not good at, as well as what are some of the potential applications for it as it relates to what we're all here for, education. And so what is Gen AI actually good at? Well, it's a really good predictor of, because of the way it uses transformers and reinforcement learning, it's really good at predicting what kinds of words should be strung together or stitched together to form an answer. It's kind of looking at every time you see one word, what's the probability of seeing another word that follows it? And then just looking at all of the different knowledge we have of the internet and constructing those different probabilities. So it's pretty good at figuring out like what word comes next after a sequence of words. But the same principle holds for things like images, videos. You can do lots of kinds of things with graphics as well. Doesn't necessarily only relate to words. And this allows it to do things like draft documents, code, images, and movies. And so, for example, on the subject of, I'm going to talk about 3 different buckets of things that Gen AI is particularly good at, and you've probably seen examples of so far, right? Creating these technical verbal documents. You guys might have heard in the news that ChatGPT, which is just a form of generative AI using large language models, scored in the 90th percentile in the bar exam, because essentially all it's doing is answering prompts by constructing and stitching together words based on probabilities. It can also do similar things by creating sophisticated plans, recipes, instructions. Most people have had some exposure, even if indirectly, to large language models like what you see with ChatGPT, where you can say, hey, I have these ingredients, what's a recipe for this? Or, hey, I'm traveling to Utah, where are some of the places that I should go, right? All that information exists online. And so it can pretty easily construct kind of what other people are saying about those different topics. ChatGPT is also really good at things like writing computer code and programming, though, for the exact same reasons, although applied to different things. And so you can actually take sophisticated data by like uploading CSV files into ChatGPT and then just asking instructions of like, hey, how would you analyze this data? Or what's the mean of this column? It can similarly do really interesting computer programming. You can maybe write dozens, if not hundreds of lines of codes instantly to kind of tackle a certain problem. And I learned this firsthand because when I was in graduate school, one of the things that I did as a social psychologist was a survey study where I was trying to understand how people's political attitudes related to their attitudes towards actually policies like education. And in doing these surveys, I had to create something called a sample size calculation, where I had to figure out like how many people I had to survey in order to determine the effect size I was looking for. But basically, I had to use a computer program, which I wasn't super familiar with. And I had to write this thing called a simulation that was really tricky and very technical and specific. And I had to kind of create almost like a mock-up version of my own data and then run through like a bunch of different iterations to see what different outcomes would look like. And for me, as someone who wasn't versed in that, it was a very difficult technical challenge. And it took me about a month and a half to figure out how to do that. And I was revisiting that same problem. It was maybe about 200 lines of computer programming that I had to do for it. And I was revisiting that problem about a year ago when ChatGPT was released. And I said, boy, I wonder if it could just do that problem that I had from graduate school. And it did. Just by telling it verbally, like what it was I was trying to do, it was able to reconstruct almost all the things that I had to learn myself when I was learning the problem and pull together all of these different associations from online and stitch together a very working prototype for me. But it can also do these similar things with graphics and creative content. So it can create poems of certain styles. It can create specific images. It can, there's actually a lot of AI now that's doing the same thing with video. And all you have to do is tell it verbally what it is you would like, and it stitches those things together. Here's a really fun example that I found for this. An individual asked ChatGPT, my 5-year-old keeps talking about what a super duper sunflower hedgehog is. What does it look like? And ChatGPT came up with these different answers for it. As you can see, very appropriate for what it is the verbal description is describing. It's looking at things like sunflowers and hedgehogs and constructed in very different ways. Again, just by looking at all of the related content associations between what does it usually see when it sees super duper? What do you usually see when you see sunflower, when you see hedgehog, and things like that? What's important about generative AI, though, we've talked a lot about the process by which it looks at everything that's out there and then creates something. But generative AI is also really good at interpreting, that is taking in information that it sees in front of it. And so here's a meme that somebody found online that says, sometimes I just look at picture of the Earth from space and I marvel at how beautiful it all is, right? And it's funny. Someone put this into ChatGPT and they said, can you explain this meme? And ChatGPT said, this meme is a joke that combines two unrelated things, pictures of the Earth from space and chicken nuggets. The text of the meme suggests that the image below is a beautiful picture of the Earth from space. However, the image is actually of chicken nuggets arranged to vaguely resemble a map of the world. The humor in this meme comes from the unexpected juxtaposition of the text and the image. The text sets up an expectation of a majestic image of Earth, but the image is actually something mundane and silly. The point of this image, again, is that ChatGPT and generative AI tools aren't only useful for spitting out content, they're actually very good at ingesting and understanding information that you put into them. What is generative AI, with this understanding in mind, not good at, though? A few things. Number one, things that require extreme accuracy. All of these content associations between words and images are able to be calculated because when you look at the entirety of information that we have, for example, online, you're able to constantly calculate the probabilities of finding this thing associated with this thing. But when things have to be extremely accurate and specific, you oftentimes find that this kind of aggregating method can't really find those very, very detailed nuances at a highly accurate level, right? So things that are really technical and have really small or incomplete vector spaces, where it's not oftentimes familiar with the association between two things, it's going to have a much more difficult time predicting. Whereas if somebody is always saying that after generative, next comes AI, then that association is a really well-established trend. It also doesn't do particularly well with things that require high levels of security and privacy. And the reason for that is that when you work with a large language model like ChatGPT, you're essentially giving them all of your information, right? So you wouldn't want to ever put in a bunch of information into there that you feel like is highly sensitive or that you feel like should be kept private, because in doing so, again, you're essentially giving that information up to a third party. So these are some of the things that ChatGPT is not good at. And so you maybe have seen examples of ChatGPT doing things like this, where people who are using it for highly, highly specific things, for which there isn't necessarily a lot of associations for the large language models to find, this is where these large language models will begin to, quote, hallucinate. They'll start to fill in what it feels like is the best outcome or what they feel like is the best result, but those things don't really relate particularly well. And so here's an article that shows that lawyers are blaming ChatGPT for tricking them into citing bogus case laws, because they would ask ChatGPT to summarize some of the case laws that relate to certain things they're discussing, and ChatGPT, not having a really good understanding of those very, very specific case laws, just kind of starts making stuff up or filling things in that don't really have the right associations. This will happen in lots of different things that you try to do. If you try to do something that's very, very specific or cutting edge, I've tried to do this before when I've asked ChatGPT to create a list of different specific scientific references for maybe a theory I'm trying to study. And it doesn't have a lot of that information because these theories are very new and the number of people who talk about them are very low. So what it does is instead it kind of like makes a bunch of stuff up, and I'll say, ChatGPT, are you sure that this is a real scientific article that was published? And it'll say yes. And then I'll go, I don't know if that is ChatGPT. Are you sure that this is a real published scientific article? And then ChatGPT will say, oh, I'm sorry, you're right. I'm still learning. I just made that up. So this is kind of like a hallucination that happens because there really isn't a lot of information about a particular subject. So how will generative AI change education, and what are some of the potential applications? Right now, it looks like there's going to be three main areas where this kind of technology is going to be very influential for education. The first is how students actually learn and produce work. In terms of writing essays, taking particular classes, it obviously is going to be used by students. That part is almost unavoidable, right? If you can just tell ChatGPT to write me an essay at a, let's say, 11th grade, 12th grade level about a particular thing, students are going to end up using this technology to help or assist them. And obviously, a lot of people are concerned about whether or not these kinds of technologies will be used for cheating. It's also very likely going to change how teachers and administrators work in terms of providing grading tools, maybe using AI to generate lesson plans, or providing chatbots that can do real-time, fine-tailored, individual kind of feedback for students that before had never really been possible. It's also obviously going to change what we teach in curriculums. Just in the same way as Joe was talking about the calculator, change the way we think about math. Obviously, math books, physics books, geometry books, they use, to some extent, calculators in their lessons now because obviously we have this technology and we're inundated with this. So there's going to have to be some incorporation of how things like ChatGPT can be used to assist in all of these different learning endeavors. Now let's talk about some of what we see the potential ways in which generative AI will actually produce real educational applications. And I'm going to organize these by the three different areas where it feels like this is what the function of these things are. But number one is in saving time, right? Teachers oftentimes don't have enough time to do all the things. They rarely have enough time to do the things where they actually need to do. But in terms of grading, all right, reviewing and marking assignments, tests, projects, you can easily see how technology like this would be useful for allowing teachers to more quickly and efficiently grade things because it can do that thing at scale. Lesson planning as well. It's relatively easy to tell ChatGPT, like, hey, create a lesson plan for me that aligns with these standards, that covers these things. And in the future, there will probably be ways to use things like generative AI to do lesson plans like directly in slides. It can also help with data entry by inputting grades, behavioral notes, other information, and just uploading those into digital systems. So removing the need to do some of the technical things, just in the same way that I was helped in graduate school, or I could have been helped in graduate school, if I had a way of asking a computer to program a particular thing that was challenging for me. It can also help with communication by responding to emails from parents, administrators, and others. ChatGPT is really good at just taking like conversational history and coming up with an appropriate response, although you'll probably want to check it before you do it, but it can save a lot of time in terms of responding to emails and communicating. Resource preparation, creating, copying, sourcing out different materials, and then obviously drafting reports, comments, evaluations for each student. All of these things have to be checked by teachers and administrators, but in terms of creating a first draft, ChatGPT and generative AI is actually really effective at doing this kind of stuff. And it can save a lot of time if you can just tell a machine to output 1,000 words of text that I just look at. That's a lot easier than me just writing 1,000 words of text from square one. And so here's an example of a math test. The name here is key, but just imagine that a student created these answers when completing a particular math test, right? And so we have a bunch of algebraic equations here that individuals have to solve for what x is in the most simplified way. And if you take a photo of this and upload it into ChatGPT, ChatGPT is actually really good at telling you all of the different answers and what the student did and whether or not what the student did was right or wrong. Again, the really nice thing about this is that it's individualized to what everyone could potentially submit for their particular test or assignment, and it provides the correct or incorrect responses. Now, previously, there was no way for a teacher to do this at scale, but these kinds of generative AI technologies will provide those types of opportunities in the future. One of the second areas, kind of building off of that, really is about personalized learning, right? You can provide this immediate feedback where AI is, human kind of level reasoning, it's automatic, and it's specific to the input. So if you're working on a project, a homework assignment a week before it's due, rather than check in with the teacher or have everybody check in with the teacher, you could see a system where students kind of check in with an automated teaching assistant where they can put in what responses they have so far, and that machine could kind of process that information and tell them where they're going right and where they're going wrong. You can also see this providing really interesting supplementary materials, additional resources or explanations on challenging topics. These kinds of chatbots are iterative, which means that you can kind of have a conversation back and forth with them, asking them to explain something or explain something differently, or dive into this topic, or I'm still not sure what you mean by this. And so it's able to provide these kinds of explanations on challenging topics that, again, previously only a teacher could do. We don't really see this as being like ever replacing teachers. I don't think that's ever going to happen, but it could be a really powerful tool that allows teachers to scale what they know to students in a different way that saves them a lot of time and provides more personal learning. We can also see this again with no-code data analyses, right? So you could analyze student performance data by simply asking a data set a certain question. So imagine taking an Excel file and just uploading it into ChatGPT and saying, hey, here's all of like the data that like our school has collected around students. Where are students struggling the most? And ChatGPT would be able to take in all that information, just like it did with the meme we were looking at with the chicken nuggets in the earth, ingest all that information and come up with a really thorough understanding of what's happening. It's going to be imperfect, but it will be thorough, and a lot of it will probably be accurate in terms of understanding the data and the trends. And the third area where we see these kinds of technologies being really helpful is in reducing things like absenteeism, right? It could do this by, number one, for example, identifying student needs. You could create an automatic system of notifications for students who are kind of involved in class based on mood and activity. So not necessarily even performance, but just kind of keeping track of what are students doing and how are they engaging, and then coming up with kind of what their needs are and what we can do to help them. It could also create these kinds of automated reminders or check-ins that could be sent to students who are at risk of becoming absentee, so that teachers can effortlessly and without thinking check in as needed. And this is something that like we actually kind of did a little bit of with a previous NSF, National Science Foundation project that I've been working on with at-risk youth in Champaign-Urbana, Illinois. The goal was basically to provide student mentors, teachers of students, an opportunity to kind of like see all of the different students and to, without thinking, give those teachers and mentors reminders of like, hey, here are the students who you haven't seen in a couple weeks and that are kind of falling through the cracks, right? That's a really difficult thing, or it could be a difficult thing to manage if you don't have the right tools or information in front of you. But you could easily create an automated system that takes all the guesswork out of that and allows you to follow up with students in a way that you feel like is going to really help. It's also possible that you could use things like generative AI to create more engaging content that kind of gets people there in school and lets them be a little bit more engaged than previously. So if you ever tried to come up with a lesson around a particular topic, maybe you ask other teachers or administrators, maybe you ask Google, but ChatGPT can just generate that for you. So there's less of a need to kind of sift through different pages. Whereas now you can just kind of tell it what it is that you want, and it'll create a pretty decent first draft at that. So there's just a few ways in which we could end up reducing absenteeism. And what I'm showing you here are actually some photos from Microsoft Teams that are starting to embed some of this type of technology where it's taking information in about how students are doing, these kinds of daily check-ins, and then providing recommendations like you see on the right for the individuals who might need support leading into next week. Again, just kind of taking that information about how students are engaging and helping reduce absenteeism. An interesting caveat and an important caveat, though, is that these tools have to be specific. Right now, there's a lot of AI tools that are very disconnected from what teachers and administrators feel, think, do. The generative AI space is moving so fast and everyone is trying so hard to create the next great thing that a lot of people aren't really taking the time to do the due diligence to make sure what they're creating is really fitting the need of a particular teacher or the need of a particular administrator. And so what you're getting are a lot of types of tools that are really just different iterations of what ChatGPT already is. And it's a great tool, but it maybe isn't contextualized or fit into the very niche way that a lot of teachers and administrators work. So here's an example of StudyMonkey. It's a subscription-based service that you can buy. You pay like a monthly fee to have access to this. And it is, in essence, it's just ChatGPT, but with a couple different extra prompts where you can specify what the subject is and what the level is of explanation that you want. And then you just ask it a question. But this is already basically what ChatGPT does. And the point of this is that a lot of people will kind of create these quote unquote tools that are of questionable utility because they're not really created by working deeply with the teachers and administrators and the systems that they work in. So in conclusion, it's inevitable that these generative AI technologies are going to be influential on society, and especially in areas like education. We think that generative AI will also change the way students and teachers work, as well as just like what the curriculum, like what it is we actually teach itself. And we see some key potential ways that AI could be used to improve education. We don't have the answers and the solutions for how this is going to work. And anybody right now who says they do have the answers is probably making stuff up. What we do know is that these technologies have to be created by working with teachers and administrators if anything is going to be created that actually sticks. And I think that's going to take a few years for us as a society to really see like what those applications are and how they can really impact teaching and education in a positive way. That's what we had prepared to talk about today. I think it would be really great now to just kind of open it up to general questions, thoughts, and maybe have a bit of a discussion from here.
Great, thank you, Pete. For those of you who have questions, if you would like to use the hand raise feature or go ahead and mute yourself or put something in the chat, and Joe and Pete can respond appropriately. Kathy.
Okay, Pete, Joe, I just want to tell you thank you. This has, I mean, you see me in the chat. I'm just like, oh my gosh, this has really blown my mind. I really want to thank you, Joe, for, like I said earlier, I kind of got what AI is, but now I'm thinking my idea of AI was like this. Now it's like, oh my gosh. And then Pete, oh my gosh. So I'm not only an educator in the pre-K-12 world, but also in the secondary college world. And I'm just sitting here like, oh my gosh, the things in my head now that I want to go and try and do, right? But like I said, we still have to be critical consumers. We really have to think about what product do we really want and what are we really getting that's meeting our needs in a conscious, and I'm going to say cultural manner. That's all I wanted to say, and thank you.
Thank you, Kathy.
Yeah, of course. Great point, Kathy.
I did want to throw out, Chuck had a question, but I wanted to say one thing as Pete was speaking, that I personally really believe, and I'm technical, so I see these things deeply. I do not believe that generative AI will ever take over the job of a teacher. And it's not because we as humans are not going to allow that to happen. It's because the technology is not adaptive enough. things change so fast with information and trends and cultural changes. I mean, that AI cannot keep up with. It's not built to keep up with that, the infrastructure. So I believe what needs to happen is, but it's going to be increasingly assistive. So what needs to happen over time is that teachers need to be able to leverage more and more of this technology. And this goes to your question, Chuck. I personally would recommend that you start using these technologies and playing around with them, but with the foundational knowledge of what we provided today. I did this lecture first for my children's school district, and what I found was that even though I just gave them 30 minutes, they said that was so helpful for them to really understand what to try and what not to try, what to expect and what not to expect, basically expectation setting. And now they're just playing around with it. Now, again, don't send your kids private data. I mean, that's FERPA violating these kind of things, right? But just start playing around with ChatGPT and get used to it, because a lot of the stuff out there on YouTube and stuff like that, I mean, honestly, I don't really think it's that helpful. I think a lot of this is just going to come from you all just trying different things that are contextualized to your work and to your domain. I think that would be very helpful.
So I have a question. In your experience, now that this artificial intelligence and chat GPT and all of this is available, is it being used at the college level, or is it even being taught in different programs at the college level that not specific to like computer engineering or things like that, that are helping people be responsible users or consumers of it?
I mean, I can just speak from, well, I could actually, on one hand, here at the University of Pittsburgh, we have a lot of folks that are very apprehensive, and specifically for teaching and learning, because they're afraid that it's going to be used to cheat. Problem is, of course, it's going to be used to cheat. But if people really understood how it works, the best way to check if they use ChatGPT is to read the essay, because it's likely going to have a lot of errors because it's not super intelligent AI. So you don't need a tool to check if they cheated. You just read it and say, Abraham Lincoln was not the 50th president of the United States. Like, that's a major failure of prediction, right? So that's one thing, is that, but then there's another group that, you know, here, especially in the medical realm, I mean, really, this is transformative for clinical application. I mean, just the ability to search for new types of cures, it's unbounded now, because it's not a human thinking about different combinations. It's this generative AI making it into vector space and all these things. So that's been really pushed ahead to see if we can cure diseases faster. And I think we are all thankful for that, so that we can kind of push ahead. So I see like those two kind of polar opposite ends. And then I've been getting invited by a lot of different universities to come speak about these things. So that kind of tells me that there's this openness to understand more, and realization that we have to all kind of grasp this pretty well, because it's not if this is going to transform things, it already is, and it's moving so fast.
Thank you. That's what I work with educators across the country, so I'm trying to find ways or help them to understand how to find the appropriate support to know what to look for or how to look for different things. So you gave me a couple of examples, but that's helpful. Thank you.
Thank you.
So, oh, sorry, go ahead.
A couple questions. Oh, go ahead, Patty.
So I work at an Indigenous school, so we're the only intertribal school in the country, and we're a K-8. So I think that part of the interesting piece for me is we can't just use ChatGPT. It's 13 plus. So if we want to be able to build those students up through, I think it's important to build some of that foundational knowledge of machine learning in those elementary students, having them understand those concepts and train machines. We've done some of that stuff here. But the other piece that I think gets interesting is that idea of data sovereignty, like who owns the information, especially when you start talking about native languages and some of these stories that are not really meant to be shared outside of the nation. And so one of the things I'm searching for is a program that will be kind of an all-in-one like K-12 program that will work with teachers and that students can use, but that's kind of like a little more isolated box inside of ChatGPT. So right now I'm playing with, I think it's called Chat for Schools, because it specifically doesn't claim intellectual property rights when you put stuff in. It doesn't take your input and throw it out into the larger language model. So those are, I think, all considerations that we don't always think about. But when students put in, like, or teachers want to create information for cultural things, it makes it so that information isn't being thrown out to be misused.
Yeah, that's actually a really great point, Patty. And the White House a few days ago released an executive order about AI technologies and being better stewards of AI technologies, and what are some of the guidelines that we as a country should follow in its use and development. And data sovereignty is a really important piece of that legislation. I think that there is a huge need right now. And one of the things, again, that ChatGPT doesn't do very well is adhere to those privacy and security standards, because they're basically just taking all of your data and it's theirs now. So we do see a really huge need amongst the different organizations and groups that we've worked with in the past as a company to create exactly what you're talking about. They're basically generative AI cars that use these large language models, but where the cars are kind of contained in a racetrack that's not necessarily in sync with, what's going on with OpenAI or Google or anything. So to your point, that's a huge need, and we see a lot of demand for it.
Yeah, and where I see a lot of this going, just to jump on from a technical standpoint, is that we will obviously get to a point where the compute is cheaper and faster, especially if we go into quantum and these kind of things, where small groups will be able to create these vector maps at a very low cost. And then that's when you're going to start to see real benefit from people in a contained and secure manner. But right now, it's just so expensive to create that larger map. And so we've got to kind of create these hacks around it that are good and secure hacks, but they're still kind of hacks. The best would be to create a separate dimensional map for each one of these smaller groups.
A couple questions in the chat. Joe, maybe you can answer this first one and I can tackle the second one. But one from Renee asks, we are starting an AI steering committee in our district to help provide some guidance. Things change so quickly, and do we have any recommendations for them?
Yeah. So I sit on, there's a committee in my children's school district. They've asked me to come participate. And I think we're all trying, I stay up to date on this daily because it's my job. And I can't keep up. So I think we're still trying to figure out what are we shooting for? The kind of whole thing of like, look where the puck is going and then try to go there. But it's like, I don't know. It's like it's changing so quickly. But I will say this, one thing that's become evidently clear is that generative AI is taking away some of the things that we thought pushing on STEM was going to really push things ahead. So like coding, just a perfect example, teach every kid coding. My question is, really now maybe we shouldn't teach so much coding, because now it's more about how can you communicate more effectively, which is skills that we would have been teaching for decades, right? How do you properly communicate in a way that is clear, concise, these kind of things, because then the computer can take that and code for you. So I think that's one thing that definitely should be considered with regards to steering committee thinking processes, is don't think keep pushing down the tech path and making everybody super technical. Maybe this technology is enabling us to realize that people need to be a bit more human, in the humanities fields, these kind of things, like the humanistic considerations are kind of being brought back up front, which they should be, it should be balanced, obviously.
Mm-hmm. And I see we have a hand raised. I want to answer one other question in the chat before we get to Sarah. But Stella asks, if languages are human products, Joseph said that the words are analyzed or were analyzed mathematically, are cultural elements borne in mind in these analyses? Because words may differ in meaning, language meaning is not the same as the sum of these words. And this is absolutely correct, right? There is no meaning behind the string of words that are kind of being put together. All that we're doing is looking at face value. When you see this word, what word comes after it. And this is where I think that communication component is so important, because not only do you have to communicate to the machine what it is that you mean with those words so that it knows what to query, but then the output also needs to be interpreted with that meaning behind it, and no machine can ever do that. You need a human user to interface with it. So that's a beautiful point, Stella. How about we take a question? We can do a couple more, I think. How about we take a question? I think Sarah has her hand raised.
Yes, hi, good afternoon, good morning, afternoon, depending where you are. Thank you so much for this presentation. I really liked how you broke it down, and it will help. In my field, I work in IT in a K through 12 public school district, and we are working on a framework for, and right now we're only at the point of educating our staff, our operational staff, our instructional staff. And they run the gamut, right? There's some that have very little experience and some that are more experienced with just AI in general. And we had a session yesterday, and what we're hearing from the teachers, their number one priority is language around cheating and AI. And they're having especially our IB teachers, and they understand like focusing on learning as a process versus the product. But when it comes down to it, the students and the parents are only concerned about the product and the end grade because they have other agenda, right? And so they feel like their administration can't support them because the county doesn't have clear defined language. Like it's not part of a student's rights and responsibilities explicitly. Like it's not written out. And so that's what we're hearing is the biggest priority that they're struggling with day in and day out. So would you have any recommendations on where to reach out, or any type of models that may be in place that has language that clearly articulates that AI piece when it comes to cheating?
I'm gonna have to say, I'm so sorry, Sarah. I personally do not, and I actually do interact with levels of congressional members with some of this stuff from the research side of things. But I would say that when it comes to legislation or just laws or rules, or like, there's just nothing right now that really speaks to this. And I also just want to throw this out there with cheating. So the next version of Microsoft Office is going to have what's called Copilot in it, which is generative AI in Microsoft Word, right? So we're going to quickly get to a point where it's going to be hard for a student not to use Gen AI when they're writing something, because it's just part. It's like, how do you not have autotype on your phone? It's very similar to that like nobody I mean, maybe some people turn off autotype, but it's like hard to figure out even how to turn it off on your phone. We're going to get to a point where Gen AI is just like the tool, right? And so I just want to throw that out there. As much as it's hard to kind of get away from the cheating concept, it's just going to be part of reality of technology.
The evolution of education.
Yeah, if Dr. Reeves was on, he would say that we need to teach students how to be critical consumers of the information that they're getting. So how could they write it better? As examples, how could they review it and make it a stronger argument or stronger paper, because it's not going away. So
I think Patty said there's many guides for administrators and policymakers with this stuff. If there is, please share, because I'm just not in that realm. So
This is all AI policy guidance for schools, toolkits from COSN, ISTE, ASCD, Atlas.
That's wonderful. I don't know any of those organizations, but that's because I'm separated from this field. Yes.
This is my binder of AI stuff. So I'll try to find if I can throw them in the chat. But yeah, there's so many. If you look up like the COSN has a generative AI readiness checklist. There's the ISTE AI toolkit, Teach AI. actually is a website that has an entire AI for Guidance school kit as well, and that's a really great one. The ISTE ASCD one I think is free. I'm trying to look at more. John Spencer just wrote some stuff on AI and project-based learning. There's just a ton of them. And I think that the big piece, like on my end, when we're looking at building a policy is, are we looking at policy or are we looking at guidelines? Because guidelines are flexible and can be changed quicker, whereas policies require 50,000 steps. So rolling some of this stuff into that academic honesty policy and then writing guidelines based on AI allows it to be more flexible and able to be reviewed more frequently and changed.
All right. Thanks, Pete, for putting your contact information in the chat. You were reading my mind. I'm also going to put mine as well. I'm the Executive Director of Creative Leadership Solutions, one of Pete's colleagues. And I just wanted to take this time to thank Joe and Pete for sharing their knowledge and guidance with us on this such timely topic. So please, we do have another one scheduled for February. However, we're going to check to see if we can put like a 2.0 version up between now and winter break. Because obviously this is information that folks need more guidance and discussion around. So we would be happy to provide that platform. As I said at the beginning of the call, because I know we've had many people join us over the hour, this will be recorded. If you registered, the recording will come to your email. You are happy to share that with colleagues. And again, just want to thank Joe and Pete for their expertise and for everyone taking time to fit this into your busy day. So with that being said, I'm going to shut the recording off and I'll hang out here for about 5 more minutes. And I'm unsure if Pete and Joe have to jump off and run or if they have about 5 more minutes before we call it and move on to our next task. Thanks, everyone.